To start our second panel, if you could make your way back to your seats. Go ahead and wrap up those conversations. My name is Caitlin Peterson, and I'm Associate Director and a Research Fellow at the PPIC Water Policy Center. It's really exciting to be here today. I'm a relative newbie to the PPIC team. I just had a 2-year anniversary. So about 2 years ago, I knew just about nobody in this room, and now I see a ton of familiar faces. So it's really nice to see so much enthusiasm and so many good people working on these issues in California. So the previous panel. First, I want to just remind our virtual audience, those who are turning in online. We'll have a 15-minute Q&A at the end of this panel, and if you have any questions that you'd like to submit to our panelists, please send those to ppiceventquestions@gmail.com if you get a chance. So we will have 15 minutes at the end there for questions. Now, so the first panel today, as you saw, really emphasized the water management questions that revolve around SGMA. This panel is about the land management questions that also revolve around SGMA. So bringing our groundwater basins into balance, working on our supplies and finding ways to enhance those supplies and reduce the transaction costs of SGMA, that's going to be a very important part of bringing basins into balance. But we know that that's not going to be enough to really close the gap. And there's going to be a real need for demand management as well. In the valley, that tends to play out as irrigated cropland coming out of production. So the consensus that we've heard over the years of working on these issues with our advisors and stakeholders is that probably the least desirable outcome for that land that does need to come out of production and is losing water is just widespread, unplanned, unmanaged land fallowing, which at best is a missed opportunity, and at worst can become a public liability. So the folks here on the stage with me are in their day-to-day working directly on figuring out alternatives for those lands that are at high risk of going fallowing and coming up with better outcomes than that outcome. So we're excited to hear a little bit more about some of these alternatives like solar development or like habitat restoration, keeping some land in production with more water-limited crops or dryland crops, and other alternatives as well. So I'm excited to introduce our panelists today. First on my left, Eric Averett, who's the CEO of Atlas Water. And prior to joining the Atlas Water Group was the general manager of Rosedale Rio Bravo Water Storage District for a number of years. Also on the board of Kern County Water Agency and the California Water Data Consortium, right? So also many hats. To Eric's left is Allison Febbo, the newish general manager of Westlands Water District. Prior to that, general manager at Mojave Water Agencies. We're very happy you could be here today, Allison. Erica Brand is a project manager at the California Energy Commission, and she works in the Land Use and Infrastructure Planning Unit. Prior to that, she directed the California Energy Strategy at the Nature Conservancy. So she's working very squarely at the intersection of land use questions, land conservation, and clean electricity in the state. And finally, at the end here, we have Ann Hayden. Ann is the Vice President of the Environmental Defense Fund's Climate Resilient Water Systems program. So she's focused on incentives-based approach to sustainable water management. Very excited to have you all here today. So I'm going to start asking each of you. We're seeing a lot of momentum around land use transitions and land repurposing, so I want to ask each of you how you're seeing that play out day to day in your various sectors or your areas of expertise. And I want to start with Allison, because I know that Westlands Water District, for a number of years now, even prior to SGMA, has had the need to transition some of their lands to other uses. Solar, doing some dry land cropping, recharge basins. So I want to ask you what the district is working on now and what the plans for the future are.
Okay, absolutely. I'm really excited to be here and chat about what we're doing at Westlands Water District. I've been there about 5 months, so I'm still getting my feet on the ground and getting up to speed on all of this, but trial by fire, and I feel like I'm learning quite a bit about how we've gotten to where we are right now. Westlands has really been challenged for 10, 20 years, and that has been leading to us needing or knowing that we need to repurpose some of our land. So early on, we were seeing regulatory requirements that were reducing our water reliability. We're seeing the climate change and drastic weather patterns that are having very wet years and very dry years. So our reliability, again, is not really there or predictable. And we also have local issues. We have drainage impaired areas where it's difficult to farm because we just don't have good drainage. And we have subsidence prone areas. So there are areas where when you're pumping groundwater, you're going to result in subsidence. And a lot of times that's near our canal. And so that's a big problem that we're trying to address. So in the past, I think, 10 years, we've acquired close to 100,000 acres that we've been intending to repurpose. Most of that land will go to solar and renewable energy, and also to providing groundwater recharge opportunities. We also are looking at a larger scale plan for kind of master planned solar development in our area. So we're trying to say, instead of being piecemeal and putting small solar developments throughout the district, let's actually look at this on a master planning utility scale. And so the district is looking at possibly putting in up to 75,000 acres of our own land. And we could have, with our growers contributing as well, up to 125,000 acres going into solar, which would contribute to a large portion of the state's renewable energy goals. So as we've talked about before, one of the major issues for being able to do that is having the transmission and the battery storage. So those are things that we're definitely going to need to be working on. But I'd say in general, we've had a board who's been progressive and looking at how we can really manage our land so that we manage our own reliability and take the future into our hands, so that we have a little bit more control over what we can do. We're strongly identifying as an ag district, but we understand that to be able to really have sustainable ag, we need to have that sized in the right way so that we can really have that productive and a robust water supply. So I think we've been fairly successful and looking forward to doing more.
Awesome. Thank you, Allison. Next, I want to ask Erica a bit about what you're working on with the CEC. I know your role involves a lot of integrating land use planning with renewable energy development. So tell us a little bit about how that's going.
Yeah, so thank you so much for having me here today. In the role I'm in the Land Use and Infrastructure Planning Unit, I focus a lot on planning for and implementation of Senate Bill 100, which is the 100% Clean Energy Act of 2018, which sets a target of all retail sales in California being supplied by renewable and zero carbon resources by 2045.
Hold your mic close to you.
Thank you. And one of the things that we know from the analyses that the state agencies have done is that to achieve SB 100, it's going to require an unprecedented build out of new energy generation, energy storage, and also transmission. And so in my role, we think about, okay, unprecedented build out, it's going to require a lot of land. Where are those new energy facilities likely to be located across the state so that we can put that information into the transmission planning process that happens in California? And as you saw from Andrew's presentation earlier, they identified transmission as one of the barriers to a significant amount of solar development in the San Joaquin Valley. So on the same trajectory between now and the 2040s that we're trying to think about, where do we plan and build all of this new energy infrastructure and transmission, we know that there are land use transitions happening here in the San Joaquin Valley. And so I think a lot about how do we bring in the data and the information that is available at the state level and the local level to inform that long-term energy planning so that we end up with a more coordinated implementation approach that helps the state and local regions achieve multiple goals.
Great. Okay, moving on to you, Eric. You have a bit of experience both in the private sector and in the public sector, and currently your role involves, or your group is involved in managing much larger tracts of land for habitat restoration and other benefits beyond that. So tell us a little bit about what your group is working on and how that's going.
Sure. Am I on? There we go. Before I provide a response, if I could maybe just introduce a thread that I hope to weave through the conversation today, and I think Allison actually touched on it. And it's one of those things that I think collectively represents the biggest challenge to this land use conversion, and it doesn't seem to be at the collective conscious level, and that is the issue of scale. And what I mean by that is when we're looking at land use transitions, most of the GSAs are looking to the individual landowners to implement pumping restrictions, but at the same time, they're not coordinating at a higher level. And so Allison had mentioned, the amount of acreage that they've collectively been able to bring in under this one umbrella. And as we look at land use planning and the need to fallow and transition, 40-acre parcels patchwork throughout the region doesn't necessarily get us to where we need to be. And so one of the things that we're looking at on the private equity or investment side is ways to aggregate those lands and work with landowners to create incentives so that they can find those larger scale solar developments, habitat conservation, flyways, those types of things. And so that's one of the things that we do in the private sector is look for opportunities to do that. We call it stacking of value. And so the projects that we look at, we may be acquiring farm ground that's going to go out of transition or transition into fallowed ground. And we'll look to see if we can develop a groundwater recharge facility on that property. And then also look to see if there's opportunities to convert it into habitat, wildlife, or flyways. And so those are some of the things that we look at. We have actually an investment mandate for sustainability, and so every project that we look at incorporates those considerations.
Okay, is it sustainability from a financial sense as well as from an environmental sense? That's what you're looking at?
Primarily from the environmental sense. Obviously, the decision to invest is driven by the financial side, but there's a sustainability requirement that we look at before we pull the trigger.
Okay, great. So just to bring us full circle then, I'll go to you, Ann, because I know that in your role at EDF, you've been very deeply involved in the Department of Conservation's multi-benefit land repurposing program, which has been, many have pointed to as a template for cooperative land use planning and implementation, sort of under the umbrella of SGMA. So tell us a little bit about what this program set out to do and what it has accomplished in light of kind of all these changes and activities happening in the Valley.
I'll try to capture that briefly. But first, thank you to PPIC for fostering these types of dialogues. This is great. Yes, we've been working on the issue of land repurposing for a number of years, going back to really 2016 when we started working with local stakeholders and partners to think about this looming land use change and how we can get out ahead of it and actually create a better future for the Valley. And not just because of impacts from SGMA, but also just water scarcity writ large. So that led us to sponsor legislation that led to the establishment of the Multi-Benefit Land Repurposing Program in 2021. And really that program, which is led by Department of Conservation, is aiming to do a few things. So it's really a companion program to SGMA. So as landowners are starting to reduce their groundwater pumping, how can they do that in ways that allows them to repurpose some of their lands to uses that don't require as much water, little to no water, and create a whole array of public benefits, especially benefits for communities and disadvantaged communities and ecosystems. Another important aspect of the program is that it's really trying to aim to get more local coordination, ideally regional coordination, so that we're moving away from that kind of piecemeal approach and really consolidating projects and being much more strategic about that. It's also very focused on making sure disadvantaged communities have a voice in the planning for these projects and for implementation, so all along the way. And then finally, it's really focused on making sure there's flexibility for growers so that they have choices whether they want to participate on a voluntary level in permanent projects or shorter term projects of at least 10 years. So in terms of highlights to date, the Department of Conservation gets a lot of credit for standing up this program quickly, getting a lot of stakeholder input in the guidance, and then getting money out the door really quickly. So the first tranche of funding was awarded in May of 2022, and there were 4 block grants of $10 million each. And I should say the demand for the applications well exceeded what was available. And since then, we've seen a ton of collaboration related to those block grants. There's 52 organizations involved in that in round 1. Round 2 was just awarded in June, this past June, and that involved 4 block grants of $9 million each. And importantly, I should say that there is a new statewide support entity that's helping with the implementation of the program, and that is co-chaired by EDF and Self-Help Enterprises, and it's really aimed at making sure that the block grant recipients have the best available information in terms of community engagement, how to leverage additional dollars from the federal government, local sources of funding, et cetera, how to message and communicate about this program, and really to have an understanding of kind of the full suite of land repurposing options that exist, and how to go about planning for and implementing those projects. So we're excited that at the end of the month, we're bringing round 1 and round 2 block grant recipients together to expand the learning network that we've created so that they have kind of a place where they can share the challenges they're facing, where the opportunities are, et cetera. And so we're really at this important point in the program implementation phase where we're gaining a lot of momentum on the planning front and working towards projects.
Okay, that's wonderful to hear. And you brought up a couple of points that I want to continue to come back to throughout this conversation. So this is sort of an overview of some of the promising opportunities that are out there that we've at PPIC have done a little deeper dive into each of them, and that are really starting to gain traction in a very real way. Some of the projects that Eric is working on are example, and many of the projects coming out of the MLRP, Multi-Benefit Land Repurposing Program, are evidencing. I want to take a minute to focus on the question of utility scale solar as a land use repurposing option. So I'll go to you first, Erica. You mentioned Senate Bill 100, passed in 2018, and that sets California's goals for 100% renewable electrification by 2045. So tell us a bit more about the scale that's needed in the context of the San Joaquin Valley and what role former cropland can play in that. And is it going to be feasible to kind of stitch together the scale of utilities that we need to make it feasible? So that's one part of the question. And then also I want to touch on the community aspect that Ann brought up. How do you cite things in such a way that considers the needed scale, but also considers the needs of communities and concerns of communities about solar development? Loaded questions.
Okay, I'll tackle the first one first. So from the analyses that the state has done, again, we anticipate needing an unprecedented build-out of new generation to achieve Senate Bill 100, and one of those resources is utility scale solar. That is what shows up in all the studies in quite significant quantities. And it requires a considerable amount of land. So in the modeling that we've done for the last Senate Bill 100 report, to build out the solar that was in those different scenarios for the future could require anywhere from 500 to over 600,000 acres statewide. And so some amount of that could be located in the San Joaquin Valley. There's already a lot of solar energy development here, and that's projected to continue and grow into the future. So in terms of scale, we saw from Andrew's presentation opportunities to locate hundreds of thousands of acres of solar to contribute to achieving the overall statewide goals. In terms of siting, it is really important to think about location, to think about how large of areas may be planned for solar energy, because there's a number of different factors that go into finding good locations for utility scale or large solar energy projects. We have to consider things like the transmission system and being able to interconnect those projects. We have to think about things like biodiversity, wildlife habitat, communities. All of these things factor in. And so what my team has been doing over the last year and a half is updating the land use and environmental information that we use to help understand how much solar energy might be feasible in different regions of California to improve our planning for energy and transmission for the future. And I think one of the places where we could get better is by having more local data and more local information on a sub-regional basis in an area like the San Joaquin Valley. How much solar energy are you thinking about, are you contemplating in some of these regions where you're evaluating land use transition options? Those estimates or those that potential estimates, those kinds of things can help improve the planning that we do statewide for both energy and transmission. So there's a lot of factors that go into siting. I think that's why coordinated upfront planning is really important, so we can think about where to locate facilities moving forward so that they can be developed more quickly to help achieve the state's climate goals, and done in a way that balances all of the other objectives of land repurposing. Did I touch on both questions?
Yeah, I think so.
Great.
Thank you. I know that was a lot. Allison, I'd love to go to you now. And Westlands has a lot of experience and has done a bit of solar development over the past couple of years. So I wonder if you could give us a little picture into how that works in your district. And I think Westlands has experimented with kind of allowing growers to have portable water credits that they can take with them if they develop their land for solar, and just wondering how this sort of incentive pathway is working.
Yeah, so as we were kind of dealing with Sigma and seeing the reduction in our groundwater supply combined with our unreliable CVP water supply as well, we were trying to figure out ways that our growers could stay in business, could stay profitable, but also reduce the actual irrigable lands that they are farming. And so what we've allowed is that a particular grower can reduce their irrigable acreage. For several years, we had that at 50%. So they could fallow 50% of their acreage, apply that water that is allocated to that land to the remaining land that they own. And now, because we're seeing changes and learning as we're going, we've just decided as a board and as a district to allow full flexibility, so it doesn't have to be 50%. It can be dependent on your particular location and situation as a grower in our district. And so it's really allowing people to identify the land that is most appropriate and best suited for irrigation, and then finding those other lands that maybe aren't the best suited but can still have value and a beneficial use. And so a large portion of that is solar. Like I said, we're also looking at groundwater recharge in some of those areas. But I think it really gives us flexibility in our district and for our growers to be able to manage their water supply. We do have a premise that that water has to stay within district, because we want to make sure that we are maintaining our district as an agricultural district, and just allowing that flexibility within our district is important to our growers. So it's something that's worked well for us.
Yeah, great. That's great to hear how some of these things are playing out in real time, in real life. So, Eric, you brought up the issue of scale, and many of the alternatives we are talking about, solar for sure, but also habitat works best when it's connected to existing habitat or is kind of aggregated in a way. So do you, things like water limited cropping systems, or you're growing, or dry land forages of this type, those are hard to make pencil out on a small scale. You kind of need some contiguous acreage. So on the question of solar, from your perspective, what is a realistic footprint for solar as renewable, as sort of a land use alternative? And what else do we need to be thinking about, keeping in mind the need for scale? We being people involved in land use and land management decisions.
Sure. So solar clearly is kind of the primary option that people are looking at. The economics of it are very attractive relative to other options that are available. But there is a sense of scale limitation. There's only so many acres that actually qualify because of proximity to transmission or just the net acreage that's available in that particular area. And so we've looked at other options such as groundwater recharge. The prior panel had mentioned that they've done an excellent job dewatering the basin, and now it's time to fill it back up. And so one of the things that we look at is there farm ground adjacent to water conveyance facilities that we have an ability to acquire and develop groundwater recharge or replenishment projects. And again, what we're trying to do is add additional value to the underlying land so that it doesn't become so devalued that it's no longer economically viable, whether it's contributing to the tax base or the landowner themselves. So groundwater replenishment or recharge activities, I think, is one of the strategies that people will be looking to. Another one is conservation. And the other one is kind of just, not wildlife, excuse me, both habitat and species restoration. And so again, but each of those requires the aggregation of those lands. And so instead of those 40-acre parcels, there has to be somebody at the land use planning. Westlands is doing it because they represent a very large area, but most of the Central Valley is very small relative to their acreage. And so we need people at the land use planning level, at the GSA or the basin level, kind of looking at these options. And then we also need some economic incentives that drive people into those or create those opportunities for them so that it may be on par or on scale with the solar option relative to the value that it stacks or adds to that land.
Great. I want to stay with you for a second and move on to the what you brought up about habitat restoration and conservation lands. This is one of the land use alternatives that's a very important piece of the puzzle, but it's also maybe one of the more difficult ones to make pay for itself, right? And sort of a different investment and incentive structure is required for habitat restoration compared to something like solar or a water limited ag scenario. So in your experience from the private sector and from the public sector, what characterizes a successful project trying to implement habitat restoration on transitioning land?
Sure. So I have a couple of examples in that, and some of it was work that I had done with Ann and her group at EDF, where we had groundwater recharge basins that operate very infrequently because of hydrology, and so they'll sit idle for 4 or 5 years. And we just managed the maintenance in a way that allowed the habitat to be restored and maintained. And then when we filled them, we flooded them at a very slow rate so that the species could move or migrate to other areas. And we had rotational recharge. And that's part of the strategy that we look at within the private equity side as well. Another thing that we look at is the ability to use the ground for multiple purposes, including dry land farming. And so some of the acreage that we have, in exchange for maintenance of that property, we allow the tenant or the farmer to go in and dry land farm. And so to the extent that they're successful in a crop, they pay a lease rate, but to the extent that they're not, all they have to do is manage and maintain the ground. You had mentioned previously some of the liabilities that may be associated with open ground and tumbleweeds and all of those things. But dry land farming may be something that's an option for some of the areas in order to kind of maintain some of that fallowed ground. But again, the thread that I hope to weave is a lot of this requires scale. I cannot emphasize enough that these 40, 60, 80 acre parcels that individual landowners may be fallowing because they get 2 acre-feet per acre, but they need 3, so they'll have to fallow 40. This is only successful to the extent that we can bring those into one land management area and manage it at scale, because the economics require that.
Right. Yeah, that's exactly the issue. So, and when we do have public funds available, in the context of something like the MLRP, what kind of projects are you seeing that have been successful at ticking all the boxes that are required for MLRP? There are a lot of boxes. maybe scale is one of those boxes, but I'm sure there are other things that need to be considered. So what sort of projects are really having the best traction?
So we're not quite at the project point yet. There's a lot of focus right now on the planning process and also being really intentional about the engagement of growers and community members in that process. But that said, MLRP funding can be used for a whole range of different projects, many of which are highlighted in your report. So low water intensity crops, solar, habitat, floodplain restoration, wildlife-friendly recharge projects, community buffers, and recreational spaces. We are hearing from some of the block grant recipients some of the ideas that are starting to percolate that seem promising. So in Salinas, they're considering exploring the restoration of floodplains on flood-prone ag lands so that they can help improve habitat conditions, improve water quality, reduce flood risks in that region. In Merced, there's an interest in building out habitat corridor from the valley floor to the Sierra foothills so that species have a place to go as there's more migration from climate change. And in Madera, there's an interest in siting repurposing of lands in close proximity to drinking water wells that are vulnerable to being drawn down so that there's a reduced pumping pressure on those systems. So there's a whole range of projects. Some projects are certainly going to be a bigger lift than others. Obviously, those that are more permanent in nature, involving habitat restoration, as we've already noted, are going to be in that category of being a heavier lift. And then there are those projects that probably are going to be a little bit more easy to scale, like restored, rangelands and, again, low water intensity crops. But we need to be really smart about how we plan for those so that we are making sure not to create new impacts and that we're indeed creating benefits for disadvantaged communities and ecosystems. So having dust mitigation programs in place, making sure that we're getting pollinator habitat in as a minimum, and improving soil health. So that gives you a kind of a sense of the scope.
Yeah, and that's a really great point that, many of these alternatives themselves have to be implemented carefully to avoid creating, just substituting one kind of impact for another kind of impact that we don't want. So, Allison, you mentioned some of the portfolio of things that Westlands has in their back pocket that they can work with, and you're also planning on fallowing a big portion of acreage. Those lands themselves, you have to manage them in some way, so to avoid them becoming that kind of liability that we're talking about. So I'm wondering if you can give us an idea of just some of those alternatives that you've leveraged for mitigation as a tool to just reduce dust risk, or a tool to reduce kind of invasive weed impact, that kind of thing. And feel free to bring in some insights from your time at Mojave Water Agency as well. I think you've thought about that a lot.
Yeah, definitely. So in terms of our land repurposing, we're a recipient of the Multi-Benefit Land Repurposing Program, $9 million block grant. And we're looking forward to planning those projects. We are trying to look at this like everyone else has said. We're recognizing that you can't do these things as one-offs. You really need to be thoughtful and strategic when you're planning how you're going to repurpose your land. And we are doing that for Westlands, but we're interested in working with partners throughout the Central Valley to make sure that we're getting the benefits that we expect. We're looking at things, a whole variety of things, including non-irrigated rangeland or dry land farming. We're looking at working with our communities because I think it's important to support the communities that are supporting us. And so going out, talking to the communities, seeing what they think our areas should look like and what our fallowed land should look like, I think is a very important component. And also looking at the future when we're, reducing our irrigable acres, we're reducing farm jobs. And so we need to do some workforce training to make sure that we're able to support the communities out there, give people hope for their future, and maintain the economy of our areas. So it's not just within our footprint, but areas surrounding Westlands also support our district. So we need to make sure that we're taking that into account. We do know that dust can be a large problem in our area and can cause health risks to residents there or workers there. So we're trying to think about ways to really look at this multi-benefit land repurposing. Things like when we're doing solar, instead of just having a bare field out there, we're starting to try to work with partners to investigate possibly doing like agrivoltaics, where you're growing some low water use crop around the solar panels and actually reducing dust risk in that way. We've also just started talking with UC Davis about potentially looking at doing some recharge around solar panels. So there are lots of ideas out there. We're going to start getting creative to be able to not just have this fallowed land of dust, but actually be able to use that land for multi-purposes and reduce risks. I see a lot of exciting opportunities out there.
Great, thank you for those examples. I want to, in the last 10, 15 minutes here, I want to bring us to the how. Okay, so we've heard a lot about what's out there, what are people working on, what are some of the promising alternatives, but there are a lot of challenges, right, to leveraging these alternatives at the scale that we need to get the kind of benefits that we want from them. So that's going to require a lot of coordination. As Cassie said in the last panel, it would be much easier if we were in a bubble, but we're not in a bubble. And like you were saying, Allison, we have to think about the land and the communities adjacent to our district, as well as what's going on within our own district. And that's a water management question and a land management question, right? So there are so many interweaving questions here. So let's just, I want to spend some time with each of you to just think about what's needed to create that glide path towards the kinds of land use transitions that we would prefer to see in the Valley and that we think would be the most beneficial. So I'll start with you, Ann, just to give us some insight into the policy landscape and the kind of funding that's available now and that maybe be available in the future, what's needed. And in the absence of funding, how can we continue making progress in the meantime?
Okay, so starting out with the funding piece, because in my mind, that is like the linchpin of actually scaling land repurposing across the Valley and doing it the right way, basing it off of a model that we've developed with the MLRP program. So, so far, MLRP has allocated $90 million. That's a great start, but it's only scratching the surface in terms of addressing the lands that are going to be impacted by all this change. So clearly, we're going to need to have much more funding dedicated to this, and we think it's likely in the low billions. We know that the demand is there and is only going to continue to grow. So to indicate that or illustrate that, in the first 2 years, over 20 overdrafted subbasins across the state applied for the MLRP funding, and they requested nearly $200 million, and we had $90 million to give. So that's just, an inkling of, I think, what we're expecting to see. So the state really needs to invest at a much greater scale. They need to see this as not only a drought strategy, but also to prepare our landscapes to be more adaptive for when we do have wet years, because we can restore floodplains, we can create recharge basins to collect water that can create other benefits as well. So I'm encouraged to see that both climate bond proposals include MLRP funding. So the Assembly proposal includes $100 million, and the Senate proposal includes $300 million, and that's likely to go to the ballot in November of next year. The feds also need to be contributing to this solution. And so we were very encouraged to see Senator Padilla introduce legislation a few months ago, the Voluntary Agricultural Land Repurposing Act, or VALRA. And it's very much modeled after the California program and basically would set aside $200 million, again, a drop in the bucket, but a start, to not only help fund some of the work that we're doing in California, but create pilot land repurposing programs across the West based off of the California program. Okay, but in the meantime, as you asked, what can we do? We need to be laser focused on getting demonstration projects in place, real projects in place to show the grower community what it is we're talking about, but also to make the case to policymakers about why this is needed and how we actually get this done on the ground. We also, to Allison's point, we really do need to be investing in workforce transition, job training. The MLRP includes a little bit of funding for this purpose, but it cannot all fall on the MLRP program, and DOC is not the appropriate agency to oversee something like that, but we need to be addressing that in a much greater way than we are currently. In terms of regional coordination, so we have these local programs that are getting set up, and we need an umbrella entity that's helping to bring all that together and actually create a more regional vision. There are some indications there might be, something like a San Joaquin Valley Conservancy getting underway, and that could be a perfect, role for the Conservancy to play, is to create more of a regional vision and kind of connect all these efforts that are showing some promising progress but need to be pulled together more strategically. And then I'll end on saying the importance of collaboration. We have to be kind of co-developing this strategy with others so that they see their perspectives reflected in the solution set, and to be talking about a whole portfolio of approaches. So we can't be talking about demand reduction and land repurposing without also talking about the supply augmentation that might be possible, that is possible, if we work together and really find a common ground across the board. So, and I'm hoping Sarah might talk about an effort that we are involved in, the San Joaquin Valley Water Collaborative Action Program, the CAP, and that's a forum where we're kind of wrestling with a lot of these challenges and trying to come up with a broadly supported set of solutions that we can actually turn into action.
Yeah, I agree. I think the words of the day are coordination, integration, collaboration, and so forth, which are easy words to say but difficult words to do, I suppose. So let's Erica, I want to move to you then. Tell us about how you think of a regional vision for energy transition, linked as it is to the land transition happening in the valley, and what does that look like from your post?
Yeah, so two thoughts on things we need to be doing now. And I mentioned it a little bit earlier. I think strengthening the connections between local or regional land use planning for energy in the San Joaquin Valley with the statewide energy planning. And one of the reasons I think that's so important now is because it takes 10 years or more to build new transmission in California. And so if we want to deploy solar at scale in the 2030s to 2040s, we need to be thinking about where now and in the next coming years, and not necessarily at a parcel level, but at a regional or sub-regional level, how much solar or how much other types of renewable or zero carbon energy are we planning for in these regions as part of the land use repurposing efforts? And so getting that information connected from the state to the local level and local to state level will be able to help us improve planning for long lead time infrastructure. And then one more point, picking up on what Ann said, I think funding is really important for land use planning for energy. The CEC, we're developing a program right now with just over $1.5 million to help support local agencies in planning for energy infrastructure to achieve SB 100. And then last week, the Department of Energy announced a $10 million funding opportunity to support local entities, local governments in planning for the siting and permitting of new energy. So I think funding will help enable the planning that needs to happen to unlock solar at scale on repurposed land.
Right. I mean, I think everyone would agree with the idea that more funding definitely helps on all levels. But I appreciate, Ann, all of your examples about all of the things that still need to happen and that we need to think about and be working on, as we're sort of working on ways to pull in the needed funding. Allison, I'm curious about your experience both in Westlands and Mojave about how do you pull off some of that integrated water planning, thinking about the funding piece, thinking about community needs, and kind of working on simultaneous priorities?
Yeah, I think Mojave Water Agency actually is a really good example of how we can make this glide path to sustainability of our groundwater basins. And they were an adjudicated basin before SGMA, so it was kind of an example for how SGMA could be developed. And what we saw is under the adjudication, they had a path that basically allowed a ramp down, what they called, to sustainability. So each year you'd ramp down a little bit more, and then eventually you'd reach sustainability. And what that allowed was for farmers there particularly, but other areas as well, to start repurposing their land. We had a lot of alfalfa in that area, which is a very water-intensive crop, and so the alfalfa started leaving, but it was a gradual process that allowed people time to adjust and adapt, and the region to adjust and adapt as well. So I think that's a good example, and I think a lot of districts and water agencies are doing that now, or GSAs are doing that. Westlands also has that plan. So we have our groundwater sustainability plan was approved. We're very excited about that. And we're on the same kind of glide path where we're reaching from, I think right now we're allowing 1.3 acre feet per acre, and we're gliding down to, by 2030, to be at sustainability of 0.6 acre feet per acre. So less than half of what people are allowed to have now, but it's going to create that market where there's trading of water availability and credits, and it gives time for people to adapt. So I think those are important things to consider. And I also say the funding is a very important component to help people start making those transitions.
Right. So I've got my eyes on the clock. In 1 minute, Eric, can you help wrap this up by giving us your view on how do we actually get closer to this regionally integrated planning that we need? Who needs to do that? What needs to do that? Is it something that already exists that we can leverage in a different way? Is it something new that needs to be created, like a San Joaquin Valley Conservancy of some kind? What's your view?
So I think those efforts have been put on hold while everyone has been focused on the development of the GSPs. But as we begin implementing demand reduction measures, I think that will become, again, more into the collective conscious. And I do see a role of the groundwater sustainability agencies trying to coordinate those efforts amongst the various stakeholders and landowners within the region, county planning departments. Anybody that has that basin level perspective, I think, should be part of that conversation. And it will include the development of all the things that Ann talked about, economic incentives that they make available and advise and make their constituents aware of. The other thing that I think is critical to this, and I know it's a topic that's been discussed in a number of different venues, is the markets, the ability to move the water to the highest and best use. It's not that these grounds have zero water supply, it's just it's not enough economically, or not enough supply to economically make that land productive, but there's still some inherent value, and a market allows that to be moved to other areas within the basin so that it can be valued. And so that's a part of the discussion as well. So I think GSAs, land use planning departments within the county, and basin level awareness, I think, is key.
Great. Thank you, Eric, and thank you to the rest of our panelists. It's time now. We have about 10 minutes left for some questions from the audience. And if there are any questions online, please send those to ppiceventquestions@gmail.com.
You're not going to let me hold it, are you? Christina Beckstead, Executive Director, Madera County Farm Bureau. I think this question's probably, let's start out with Allison and then maybe some follow-up from Erica. In your development of the solar, obviously within the district, 75,000 acres is a lot of solar. Are you finding that you're having struggles for transmission purposes? I mean, from an infrastructure point, I think you guys have probably got that handled, but at a state perspective and talking to the utility companies and whatnot, I mean, Erica mentioned it's 10 years to build something, right, to get that infrastructure in place. What troubles are you having? And then are we going to see, is the Energy Commission making an effort at the state level to push things along? Because as of right now, utilities are telling us they need 10 years to implement what they need for today, right? So they don't even have the ability right now to think to the future into 2040 because we don't have enough in place from an energy standpoint right now?
Yeah, I can speak to that. That's absolutely correct. I think the biggest obstacle that we have right now and the biggest unknown and risk to us being able to do this utility scale solar is getting that transmission and just basically getting rid of some of the roadblocks. We need state leadership. They've already decided what their renewable energy goals are, so now we actually need a process that can make that happen faster and more efficiently. Like you said, 10 years is not going to do it for us. We need something much faster, and so we are trying to work with the Energy Commission and work with the state. There's just processes out there that there's lots of planned solar, and I'd say 9 out of 10 projects can't happen because there's not connection to transmission. So I will defer to you, but that is definitely a major risk for us.
Yeah, there's a lot of challenges and there's a lot of obstacles. From my perspective, I've seen the agencies, energy agencies, collaborating in a way to try to work together to overcome those barriers and address pinch points in the processes. And there's more work to do as we move forward into this transition.
Scott Hamilton I'm the chairman of the Technical Committee for the Water Blueprint. And I think this question's for you. It's always bothered me that land repurposing was sort of the first option that everybody went to rather than the last option. And in my calculations, there's like 1 million acre feet of uncaptured water on east side rivers. We saw a lot more than that, go this year. And it seemed to me that the DWR and the State Water Resource Control Board and all of the groundwater sustainability plans focused on what was not in the plans rather than what was in the plans. So we've got hundreds of really great local projects in these GSPs that could really help capture some of that 1 million acre feet, so much of the floodwater that was lost this year. But so many of those projects are, they're small projects, it's difficult to get grants for. We're seeing the Department of Conservation spend millions to take land out of production. And we're not seeing money go readily to all these small projects could really make a big difference. How do we get more government sort of attention on funding these local projects?
Well, I definitely think it's a both and approach that needs to be taken into consideration. So, I think in the last panel we talked about great efforts that are underway to get more of that water, underground through very creative recharge projects and the challenges around getting conveyance and funding to actually get those projects implemented, and not to mention what happens in wet years when there's permitting challenges, et cetera. So I know in the CAP we're thinking a lot about how to move on the kind of the streamlined permitting to make the executive order we experienced last year, real in future wet years. I do think there's a need to, as I mentioned previously, to be talking about these strategies as a portfolio. It's really not an either or. We can't be just hyper-focused on supply augmentation and think that the next surface storage project is going to solve it for us. It really is, all of the above. So I think that's why I made the point I did, which is we can't be talking about land repurposing without also simultaneously talking about being creative about getting, better more recharge projects in place and implemented. So, I think creating more of a public dialogue about the whole portfolio as opposed to one or the other is going to be critically important going forward.
I'd like to add, if I may as well, and I didn't note this, but it's important for our district that our land repurposing is long-term but temporary. So we still have hope that things like you're talking about can actually restore some of our supply, and we may be able to bring some of that land back into irrigation at some point. So we're not closing the door. Our repurposing isn't forever, but this is a way to adapt and be able to use what we have now.
Yeah, and I'll just wrap up by saying that I think the rationale behind this panel specifically is not to ignore the supply side of the question, but to acknowledge that even if we do a really great job, if we find 100 million or 1 million acre feet of new supplies lying around somewhere, we're still going to need to bring a lot of land out of production. and we have to be thoughtful about what's going to happen to that land. So, another question here?
Yeah, John Shelton, recently now with the Bay Institute. One of the things I've worked with the last few years in my career before the Bay Institute was tribal issues. I haven't heard much of the inclusion with the tribes on finding out from them traditional ecological knowledge on managing the areas within the basins, or any of the work that you could be doing with the tribes. And I know this is something a lot of you do things with, and so I just want to see what your thoughts are at this point.
I can speak to that. I failed to mention that is part of the multi-benefit land repurposing program. There is some funds set aside for tribal engagement and their own development of land repurposing plans. So Department of Conservation has been doing a lot of outreach. As you probably know, these relationships take time to develop, and it can't just be a transactional, we've got a new program, sign up and participate. So I think it's going to take time, but you raise a really, really important point that has to be front and center in terms of how we're thinking about who's going to be impacted and who needs to be engaging as these decisions are being made about the future of land and water use in the valley.
Josh Yerkin with the U.S. Bureau of Reclamation. And you made a comment earlier about that the Department of Conservation is not necessarily the place for workforce transformation or job creation. Where do you think that is? And that's open for the rest of the panel as well,
Others
too.
should chime in, but an agency like the Strategic Growth Council, I mean, who's been thinking a lot about economic development and just transition, to me, seems probably more appropriate than the Department of Conservation, that this is just well outside of the scope of their mission. But others should chime in.
Erica, anyone? All right, next question.
Okay. Ralph Pistoresi, farmer, probably 55 years farming. I think I know something about farming. You guys used to use the term dryland farming. We're going to change everything into dryland farming. All that fruit you ate over there today, you'd be eating oat hay, because that's the only thing you can grow dryland farming on a wet year. You're using terms that you don't understand the consequences of the terms. All your fruits, all your vegetables, none of that, all of your almond crops, none of that will you have by farming in what you're describing as dryland farming. Dryland farming is putting a seed in dry ground and praying it's going to rain enough to make a crop. You don't do that with any crop there is. Most people eat 3 times a day, and unless they're going to eat oat hay or chew on a solar panel, you're not going to be happy. But I'd like you to...
Thank you for the comment. And I'll just point out that I don't think it's anybody's first choice to plant dry land, oats, or wheat instead of our wonderful diversity of fruits, vegetables, watermelons, almonds, as you say it. This is more of a conversation about what can we do with the lands for which there are no other options, and can we make some productive use out of them when the water is simply not there, and when there's no other good use. So I think that's, yeah.
Can I
Allison?
address as well, just for Westlands? We are an agricultural district, and we know the value of our fruits and vegetables and fiber. In my view, being able to do this land repurposing is actually allowing us to solidify the ag that we can actually irrigate on an annual basis to be able to provide that food and fiber. So instead of going from like 0 allocation to 100% allocation back to 0 allocation, as we're trying to repurpose land and manage our water within our area, we can every year have at least some water to keep that agriculture going.
Great point. Thank you, Allison. Our time is up, so thank you everyone for the great questions. It is time for lunch. You will find that there are boxed lunches on either side of the room. So go ahead and grab yourself a box, make yourself comfortable. We'll return back here in about 30 minutes. So please give us a round of applause for our wonderful panelists. Thank you so much.